What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we are ranking the 4th albums from classic death metal bands. Alright, as usual, let's kick things off on a very strong note with Immolation and Close to a World Below. So this album came out to pretty universal critical acclaim and is probably my favorite in their entire discography. That fiery sound of their guitars appropriate to their band name here is just amplified by 1000 alongside apocalyptic sounding barrages of drumming. The whole thing conjures this image in my head of this giant blaze just billowing out of cracks opening in the earth with demons crawling out. And as I said in my Immolation tier list, it's basically like a more brutal alternate soundtrack to the Night on Bald Mountain segment of Fantasia. Just ravaging start to finish and a huge step up from the previous albums, I think. I'm putting it at perfection. Next up is Cannibal Corpse with The Bleeding. So this was the band's most successful album and the 5th top-selling death metal album in the US. It's also Barnes' last album, with him going for more of this like gravelly, kind of Nathan Explosion sounding delivery, but also with him starting to play more with the classic E. Also a little bit more groove-oriented in the guitars, some great tracks here, Fucked with a Knife, Pulverized. I also like the slower, more atmospheric opening of Return to Flesh. Definitely a fan favorite, probably second best of the Barnes era in my opinion, and one of their top albums overall. I originally, when I was starting to make this list, had this in Fantastic, but it got beat out by the competition here, so it's getting a great. And you know it's going to be a stacked ranking when a classic like The Bleeding ends up in the middle. Speaking of which, let's talk about Death with Human. Now this was easily one of my least popular ranking hot takes on my Death discography tier list, as it's actually on kind of the mid to lower end for me there. I just find it to be very cold and detached. However, I do not deny the incredible performances and importance of the album both within their own catalog and the death metal genre in general, especially to the technical death metal and progressive death metal world. So for that, and in comparison to some of the other picks here, it's landing a spot at Fantastic. And I already know that's not going to be good enough for some of you. How are you crazy? That should be a perfection tier. My list, my rules. Alright, Cryptopsy, and Then You'll Beg. So appropriate to the title, it feels like we're doubling down on the brutality here, even taking on a more raw production sound that reminds me a bit of the debut. Unfortunately, its heaviness is at the sacrifice of quality, in my opinion. Like, I'm just being bludgeoned repeatedly, and while this album is still undoubtedly impressive in its technicality above many other albums in the genre, it doesn't feel like it's in service to memorable tracks, and I tend to lose interest as a result. Not a fan of the vocal choices here either, lots of very rah kind of vocals, and there are a few standouts: My Prodigal Son, Scar, and Envision Sore Vision. Also screams go unheard with the throat singing. I'm going to put this one at good tier. Then we have 6 Feet Under with True Carnage. Now, depending on how you look at it, Graveyard Classics is technically the next album, but if we're just looking at their mainline discography, then this is the 4th album. Definitely has some fan favorites here, like The Day the Dead Walked, One Bullet Left, and Sick and Twisted, but to me, it's just another 6 Feet Under album. Fine if you enjoy them, as always, it's just an opinion, there's no objective ranking, of course. There's just no way, though, you slice up any of these lists and 6 Feet Under doesn't end up at the bottom of the pack, in my opinion. Like, let me know down in the comments if you disagree with that, but just by comparison to the competition here, it always needs to end up at the bottom.
It's not good.
Alternatively, one of my nice little standout picks here is Vader with Litany. So definitely one of my favorite Vader albums and my overall favorite of their early discography. It's just packed with killer hooks on great tracks like Wings, Zephyr, Litany, The Calling, Forwards to Die. Cold Demons has that tank intro. Some may not like the very electronic sounding thump of the bass drum, but I think it adds sort of a charm and makes for a very memorable album intro too. Serious head-bobbing beats, the fun vocal performances that are fun to scream along to. It was nominated for a Friedrich Award for Best Hard and Heavy Album of the Year. Very tight 30-minute runtime too. I'm going to put it at perfection tier. Next up is Dying Fetus with Stop at Nothing. So at this point in their discography, everyone quit except for John Gallagher. So this is otherwise a completely new lineup, and you can definitely hear the difference from the previous album. But overall, I dig just how fast and aggressive it is. I'd even argue it's one of their heaviest albums overall. Great opener here with the destructive schematics. That riffing is ridiculous. And then other great tracks like One Shot, One Kill, Onslaught of Malice, and Institutions of Deceit. Tons of great drumming. I'm going to put this one at fantastic, and I'm sure there's going to be a few people upset to see this beating Cannibal Corpse, but all said and done, I just have more fun with this album. Alright, Atheist with Jupiter. This is actually the most recent album on this list since they had a 17-year gap between this and their 1993 album Elements. Great technical performances as usual, but not as much finesse in pulling it all together into a consistently engaging masterpiece like their other albums are. The songs get a little muddled. It's a little out there. It also strangely falls into repetition at times, which was never an issue on the previous albums. I still commend it for the 32-minute runtime, but even so, it feels just lacking in that focus. It's definitely my least favorite of their albums so far. I'm going to put it at good tier. Alright, let's do Bolt Thrower with the Fourth Crusade. Now, I know some fans really love this album, but considering I'm not all into like Candlemass and Pentagram, and those were the types of bands that influenced this particular album, it's not exactly a go-to for me, but that said, it has some solid dynamics, memorable riffs, and above all, the atmosphere is really great here. So more of just a different strokes and personal taste thing here that I don't love it, but I do respect it enough that I'm going to put it at great tier to kind of balance it out. Alright, next up is Incantation with the Infernal Storm, and I just feel like this album is, speaking of repetition, like very, very repetitious. Honestly, more so than on any of their other albums leading up to this one. Both the intensity and pacing have been somewhat lost too in favor of something far more just bland, and while you get a lot of different speeds, they seem to change almost at random without much care for the overall flow that Diabolical Conquest had. Once more, also hearing ideas that I feel like have been mastered and done better now by bands like Portal at this point. So ultimately, this one's going to upset some people. I know there are some big Incantation fans out there, but I'm putting it at okay, not my thing. Let me know in the comments if you love this album and why. Back to a great one though, we have Carcass with Heartwork. So almost cheating since we're moving into the more melodic death metal style at this point. So it gets to be on both genre videos. Check out my melodic death metal album tier list if you haven't been already. But I'd say, considering that some of these other albums are also moving into more of a prog and melodic directions, I don't think it's too unfair. But anyways, it goes without saying, this is a beloved classic, though I'm sure there are those that were upset with Carcass going in this direction. Regardless of how you feel, it's a benchmark release, and along with albums like Slaughter of the Soul and The Gallery a year later, more or less set the blueprint for the entire genre. Personal favorites here: Carnal Forge, No Love Lost, and Death Certificate. Easy perfection tier, very high at that. Carcass once more getting a top spot in one of my favorite death metal discographies. Next up, Deicide with Serpents of the Light. So I hear a slight shift in production with this one. It's almost kind of Slayery. Maybe not the most standout on this list, but it has plenty of bangers, like the title track, Absolutely Kills. Slave to the Cross is strangely catchy. The Truth Above has a pretty sick melody that gets stuck in my head. I see some Deicide haters pop up here and there in the comments, but this is another just consistent ripper of a death metal album that feels right at home at the bottom of great tier. Then we have Nile with Annihilation of the Wicked. This was actually the highest rated album on Metal Storm in their discography, which was interesting since I feel like there are other ones I enjoy more, and also other albums that come up a lot more in conversation. But anyways, definitely a banger with tons of great technical riffage and use of atmosphere. I love the sitar intro. It really sets the stage, and then Cast Down the Heretic just demolishes the listener right after that. More great tracks: Sacrifice unto Sebek with those wild melodies, Lashed to the Slave Stick. The production also feels like an improvement over the previous one, in addition to the songs feeling less insane but more dynamic, even going pretty doomy towards the end. I'm going to put this one at fantastic and pretty high up on that tier. It could have easily gone to perfection, but it falls just short of the top 4, and as always, that's my rule. I want to keep things challenging and interesting, only 4 per tier. Alright, Obituary with World Demise. So once more, I'm gonna upset the Obituary fans and say that while I was already not that into their first 3 albums, it's around this one that the word passable starts to come to mind. It's not terrible, it's not even unenjoyable to listen to, but it just offers very little in the way of substance for me, and the vocals can actually get a little bit annoying. I will say that they do a good job of capturing the dreary tone of the album cover with the sludgy grooves of the guitar, mirroring the choking air pollution, but ultimately it's overlong, kind of boring. I'm just going to put it at good tier. Alright, Pestilence with Spheres. So this is the final album before a 14-year hiatus from 1994 to 2008. Finds them experimenting with a more progressive sound with guitar synthesizers too and jazz influences. More fun proggy guitar work, but the songwriting does get a little avant-garde to the point that it feels like style over substance here. Very spacey, as usual. A little messy and meandering, but with solid performances. I also like the interludes. It reminds me of like PC gaming back in the 90s, so not one of my favorites on here. I think they've kind of like slipped a little bit in quality from the last 2 albums or so. I'm going to put it at good tier, kind of right alongside Atheist. Next is Suffocation with Souls to Deny, so feeling a bit more like the same from the previous outing, but also with some subtle variations in the riffing that I am appreciating here. And there are some forays also into stepping up the atmosphere with tracks like Souls to Deny, some more melodic moments as with the kind of Carcassy, Subconsciously Enslaved, and actually on repeat listens this time I found myself getting a little bit more into it and also noticing some of the more dynamic songwriting. So another solid meat and potatoes death metal album, but with enough flair to elevate it to great tier. Oh boy, then we have Autopsy with Shitfun. What a truly terrible or amazing album cover, depending on how you look at it. And the album is about what you'd expect from that, so at least it fits the music, I guess. Very sort of chaotic and random, especially in the vocals. Lots of rough production choices here. Honestly, it's not as terrible as I expected, and it actually has some decent riffs here and there, and if nothing else, it keeps you on your toes. It's the lowest fan-rated album on Metal Storm with a miserable 6.3, which is almost a full number grade lower than the next one above it. Not something I would readily choose to re-listen to, but I wouldn't necessarily say skip it either. I'm going to put it at okay, not my thing. Gorguts, From Wisdom to Hate. So this album takes the insanity of the previous album and fuses it with elements of their older albums to an extent. Very impressive, highly dynamic, a bit more concise than Obscura in some ways. I did see some calling it more accessible, but that's still what made grading this one tough, because it is definitely one of the most challenging listens on this list. So in that respect, it ends up being one of the most impressive, but it's also not something I can re-listen to as often. It's more of like a mental workout versus some of the kind of comfort food albums on this list. Some truly catastrophic bangers on here, like Inverted, which has a riff like a rusted locomotive, but also some down moments to really up the contrast. This is also the last album before they originally disbanded, and it took me a while to kind of lock this in. I was going back and forth with a couple different albums, but ultimately, I'm going to put this one up pretty high on Fantastic. Alternatively, we have Entombed with To Ride, Shoot Straight, and Speak the Truth. Moving even further into their more hardcore-inspired death and roll sound, along with garage and stoner rock. I debated even including it on the list. This will probably be the last Entombed album you'll find on here. There's like just enough DNA left to warrant maybe including it here. It's not the worst thing by any means, but I'm not a big fan of this side of their sound, and especially on this list, obviously it belongs at the bottom. And then we're going to wrap things up with Morbid Angel and Domination, so I am all in Team Domination. Love this album. It was my first Morbid Angel album I heard, and among the first death metal albums I heard, so I have a little bit of a bias there. It's also the first album with Hate Eternal and now Cannibal Corpse guitarist Eric Rutan. Where the Slime Live may be my favorite Morbid Angel song of all time. It's one of my favorite death metal songs of all time. The vocal performance is just so bizarre and memorable and unique. This album just steps up the atmosphere and the groove focus, but ends up with a very diverse sound with each song having its own personality. Other great tracks here: Dominate, Eyes to See, Ears to Hear, Dawn of the Angry with that instantly recognizable tremolo line and all the crazy shifts in pacing. Honestly, y'all, this album rips, and it definitely deserves to be at perfection tier. Y'all check out this playlist for more death metal videos, and this playlist for more metal tier lists, and let me know down in the comments what is your favorite album on this list. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.